Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Gravity Goldberg on Teach Like Yourself, Why Your Students Need You to Be You. Just to let you know, if you have any questions for Gravity, please send them using the chat function within Zoom. We will answer as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation. And if we can't get to all questions, answers will be sent to all attendees later in the week and also through Facebook and Twitter. Now what I'd like to do is turn the meeting over to my colleague, Ariel Curry from Corwin, to introduce today's presenter.
Thanks, Jeff. So I am the editor for Corwin Teaching Essentials, and it's my pleasure to introduce Gravity Goldberg. Gravity is an educational consultant in New York. She studied at Boston College and Teachers College at Columbia, and she's the author of 5 books. So you may know her as the author of Mindsets and Moves and What Do I Teach Readers Tomorrow? And she's also a new mom to baby Leo. She's known as a literacy consultant, but today she's here to speak with us about a very different book for all teachers, Teach Like Yourself, How Authentic Teaching Transforms Our Students and Ourselves. So Gravity, I'll hand it over to you, and thanks so much for doing this webinar with us today.
Thank you, Ariel. And thanks everyone for taking some of your time on this Monday after a long Thanksgiving weekend. If that's when you're tuning in live, and if you're listening not live, thanks for joining too. So I want to just start by telling you a little bit about this book before we jump into the content of it. And Teach Like Yourself was a pretty personal book to write. And in a lot of ways, it almost felt like the biggest challenge of the 5 books that I've written, because I can't simply say, teach like yourself, here's how to do it. That would be defeating the whole purpose of it. Instead, this book really stemmed from my desire to help all teachers, including myself, to be honest, to reconnect with why we became teachers, to that really authentic sense of when we're in flow in the classroom and it's working for us and our students. And how do we bring that every day to the classroom, as opposed to feeling like we need to be somebody else, that we need to follow somebody else's script, or we need to be funny like somebody, or use somebody else's lesson plans. Because we know from experience, at least I certainly do, that when I'm trying to be somebody else, I'm so in my own head that the lesson always falls short of what my students need. So I ended up writing this book with sort of 3 main elements that I'm going to take us through during this webinar. And those 3 elements are: 1, part of this book is memoir and personal stories of my own teaching experiences, and also the many teachers I've had the privilege of getting to work with. So I'm going to tell you some stories tonight, which are also woven throughout the book. A second part, or practices that come from the research on authenticity, that I'll take us through. And these are very actionable practices that are grounded in the research, like I said. And then the third part, which I can't really take us through in depth today, but certainly is really specifically and intentionally put into the book, are areas to reflect. And unlike a lot of other books that I've written, there are places right within the book where you can take some of the practices and some of the stories and reflect on your own experiences and write directly in there. And I'll give us a little bit of that reflection time today, but hopefully you'll use this webinar as an invitation to continue some of that beyond our time together. So let's get started. So Brene Brown is somebody I totally admire, as do many educators I know. And I want to start with this quote that happened to end up in my inbox a few weeks ago. She said, "What we are ethically called to do is create a safe space in our schools and classrooms where all students can walk in and, for that day or hour, take off the crushing weight of their armor, hang it on a rack, and open their heart to truly be seen." And what struck me about this quote is this idea of the armor, and how, as a teacher, I've been so aware of that crushing weight. And it wasn't just the crushing weight of my students, but also of myself. And so it led me to think about this idea of, like, we can't offer others, especially our students, what we don't have ourselves. And so how can we create these safe spaces for students to learn like themselves is a question that I've been asking for years. And really what it brought me back to was this idea of we have to give ourselves permission to teach like ourselves. So if we want true student voice and engagement and students to have ownership of their learning process, we teachers need to be experiencing all three of those things ourselves too. That we need to feel engaged, like our voice matters, that we're the chief decision makers in our classroom, and that we have ownership of what happens within those four walls most of the time, all day, every day. Yet that's not necessarily what I'm seeing in school and after school and classroom after classroom for a variety of reasons. So here's the sort of bummer research that I'm going to start with, and then I promise I'll talk about the hope of what it could be. So we know that as of 2017, the Educational International Research shows that in the US, there's 150,000 new teachers that are trained every year, yet half of them will quit within their first 5 years of teaching. And when I share this statistic live, when I'm presenting or working with groups of teachers, I ask teachers to stand up if you've made it more than 5 years, and I ask everyone to give them a round of applause because they've already beat the statistic. So if you're somebody who's tuning into this webinar or read the book and is in that camp, that's amazing. And if you're within your first 5 years, this is not in any way to scare you, but to say that this is the reality. And I think one of the antidotes to having the amount of teachers leaving the profession is to really embrace and support the kind of authenticity we're going to talk about today. Here's another statistic. So Russ Quaglia has done, some really large scale surveys, and what he found is that 69% of staff in schools, specifically teachers, are excited about their future career in education. And at first I thought 69%, okay, that's more than half. But then I thought about that's 31% of teachers who are not excited about their future career in education. And I think about what that would mean, and I know this is not the exact conclusion that he's drawing in this survey, but if we just played that out a little bit logically, that 31% of the teachers that are in front of our kids or side by side with our students every day, if they're not excited about the future that they have in teaching, how might that be impacting their career also? And one more piece of research to support this is Russ Quaglia has also studied student voice, not just teacher voice. And he and his colleagues found that when students' voices are a part of the decision-making process in schools, it helps increase students' self-worth, engagement, and purpose. And this is all what we're really talking about in schools these days when I'm in schools, is the idea of how do we help increase students' engagement, that we know that sitting passively and doing enough to get by the quote unquote doing school just isn't enough. But what I'm seeing is it's not just students who are doing school and doing enough to get by, it's also some of us teachers, and it's not necessarily our fault. So I want to talk not necessarily about, how terrible it is that new teachers are leaving the profession, that we have over a third of teachers, or about a third of teachers, who are not looking forward to their future as teachers. Yet we know that voice really matters. I want to talk about what we could be doing to be teaching like ourselves, what might be actually solving some of these challenges. So first and foremost, if we want to stay in the classrooms, but stay in the classrooms for the right reasons, where we feel excited and inspired every day and we actually look forward to the interaction we have with our students, then it probably makes sense to start at the beginning. And at the beginning is our core beliefs of why we became teachers, but also what we believe about teaching and learning. And I want to tell a short little story here. If you look at the photograph that I chose here, this is me in a somewhat precarious situation. So for my whole life, I've been afraid of heights. More specifically, I've been afraid from falling from heights, which you could say is quite ironic considering my parents named me Gravity. And people often would laugh at that. But it got to the point where I was avoiding things that I thought could actually be really fun and fulfilling in my life. And at the time that I really wanted to conquer this, I was living in New York City, where some of even the escalators to go up and down buildings and the subway were things I was terrified of. So my now husband was really listening to me saying, I really have to get over this fear. And one year for Christmas, I opened up a package, and in there was a gift certificate to take a trapeze lessons. And I smiled and said, thank you, in the sort of fakest smile possible, because I wondered why on earth he had gotten me this gift. And when I asked him about it, he said, well, I was listening and I remember you saying this was the year you wanted to conquer your fear of falling. And I thought, what better way to do it than to go jump off a trapeze? So I got that gift in December. And in August of that following year, he reminded me it was going to expire and said, if you don't take me up on this offer and go take this lesson before the school year starts, it's never going to happen. So on August 30th, I showed up for trapeze lessons in New York City. And when I got there, it wasn't just a trapeze inside of a building. It was actually on the roof of a multi-story building in New York City. So already I was on my edge. And I made a pact with my husband that I would do this only if I went by myself. So I sat there literally biting my nails and watching as first about an 8-year-old boy climbed up, propelled himself up the ladder, jumped off the ledge, and flew through the air. Came down, said, wee, when do I get to do it again? I watched as person after person, all body types, some athletic looking, some not so athletic looking, all ages, went up and seemed to have a fabulous time until it was my turn. And I put my hands on the rungs of that ladder and slowly, one by one, taking long, deep breaths and talking to myself in my head, reminding myself I was okay, I was safe, I climbed up to the top. And for those of you who've never jumped off a trapeze, here's the thing they don't tell you until you get up there. Yes, you are harnessed in, so luckily you're actually very safe. But you have to reach over the ledge and actually grab the trapeze bar while somebody holds you from behind, because if they don't hold you, you will literally fall. So with all my courage, I reached out one hand at a time and grabbed the bar. And then the nice, kind woman who was holding me from behind in the harness says, oh, at the count of 3, you need to jump in the air. If you just drop, you're not going to go anywhere, and you could actually come back and hit the platform. You have to jump in the air. And I'm thinking all sorts of crazy things I will not repeat right now. And I'm thinking, okay, well, I have to get down one way or the other. It's either back down the ladder or it's through this trapeze. And finally, at the count of 3, I jump into the air and I fly through the air and I scream at the top of my lungs. In fact, I have a video of it and I laugh at myself every time I hear it and I see it. And it actually was stupendously, amazingly exhilarating, so fun, even though I was scared out of my mind. And I ended up doing it multiple times that day. And I'm telling you this story not so that everyone runs out and decides they want to take trapeze lessons, although I do recommend it. It was really fun. But more like there were many things that I questioned during that. Like, why did my husband do this to me? Am I going to die? Is this harness really going to work? But the one thing that I never questioned was my why. I was so clear on why I was doing this. My purpose was the thing that got me through it. I knew I no longer wanted to be living in fear of falling and of heights. And I think so much about my career as a teacher and the teachers that I get to work with that so many of us every day can feel paralyzed by fear. And to be honest, some of that fear is not going away. Every day in the classroom, I experience some level of fear, some more than others. But the thing that gets me through it is knowing my why and getting really clear on my purpose. And it almost becomes this sort of courage that that gets me through that. And so I want us to take a little bit of time to think about our why and our core beliefs, because they really can be the courage that gets us through the days or the moments when we feel paralyzed by fear. And what I've found is that what people value is what moves them through the world. So the antidote, so to speak, of that paralysis of fear to get us moving is our why. And I love how Larry Ferlazzo talks about this as in terms of how do we create movement in ourselves and in our students. And he said there's 2 main ways. One way is through irritation. And when we use irritation, we're challenging people to do something that we want them to do. Agitation, on the other hand, is when we challenge people to do something that they want to do. And not surprisingly, both can get people to move in a direction or to get them going. But agitation is the thing in the long run that's going to get people moving over the long haul with a lot more engagement. So in order to use agitation on ourselves or with our students, we need to know what it is that we want. And sometimes we might think we know what we want, but unless we're really in touch with our core beliefs, sometimes it's too abstract. So here is another way that we can look at it, and then I'm going to offer a practice for one way we can get in touch with that. So many of you might know Simon Sinek's work. He wrote a book and had a really popular TED Talk called Start With Why. And he actually is a consultant and business leader and author. And he says that people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. And while the word buy might seem kind of strange here, if you think about it, our lives as teachers, we are selling something. It might not be for money, but we're selling kids on the fact that what we're teaching matters. We're selling them that their effort's going to be worthwhile. We're selling them on their relationship to us and on learning and to their peers. And so that idea of why is not just important for us, but also for our students. So this is called the golden circle, and Simon Sinek recommends that we start with why and get crystal super clear on why are we doing what we're doing, and then think about the how are we going to do it and the what are we actually going to be doing in the moment to moment, day to day of our work. And this is in direct opposition to how most teachers plan and how most of us were taught to teach. I even think back on the early and even middle years of my career, and I definitely started with the what, the objective. Like, what is it I wanted my kids to be doing, or what was I going to be teaching? And I think by simply inverting the order of how I plan and how I teach and how I communicate to kids to have the why come first, it's made a huge difference. Because what's almost always the question that I find students of all ages are asking, whether they say it out loud or they're thinking it in their heads, sort of like, why are we doing this? So by starting with the why, that we are crystal clear ourselves and our students know the why, it changes everything. So here's one practice, and I offer several others in the book, but here's one that we can think about tonight. So if you want to get crystal clear on your why, then one of the things you might want to do is keep a question journal. And the thing about a question journal I want to be really clear about is a question journal is not a question and answer journal, because we actually know that the second we think we have an answer, we actually stop being curious. And it's our curiosity that's going to lead us perpetually deeper into our purpose as teachers. So here are just 3 fairly simple, totally free ways you can do this. So the first thing is to start to pay attention to the questions that you're asking on a regular basis about your practice. So that question could be really specific about a particular unit you're teaching, or about some students, or about an area of your curriculum, or it could be really general about teaching. So you can decide how broad or narrow you want to pay attention to those questions. And then don't answer the questions. Hold yourself back. That doesn't mean that your question doesn't spur other questions. Often I start with a really broad question like, how do I get students more engaged? And that leads to a ton of sub questions that sort of stem from that. Like, well, what is engagement? And, are there things I'm doing to get into the way of engagement? And what does engagement feel like? And was that engagement yesterday during 5th period? And all of a sudden I have more questions than I started with. And once I've accumulated several questions, and that several again is sort of up to you for what feels like enough to actually reflect on, then I read through them and start to categorize the questions. And as I categorize them, that's where I start to recognize the underlying core belief. So even in that example I just shared, I have some sort of value or belief that engagement is essential for learning. And where that comes from is by paying attention to the questions I'm asking. And there might be some that you could right away that are sort of super obvious to you, and that's fine to start with. But if you stick with this long enough, for example, on a regular basis for months or even this whole school year, there will probably be core beliefs that pop up, especially during the times of the year where you're feeling exhausted or less than inspired, that might surprise you, even if you're not in your first few years of teaching. Every time I've done this, something comes up that surprises me that was sort of in the dark that I needed to bring to the forefront to keep me going. And another way to think about this in some ways is that if you can recall back to when you were in your first teacher education program, how we were all asked to write our philosophy of education that ended up somewhere in your teaching portfolio, that in a way, it might be the kind of thing that you did before you became a teacher because you were asked to do it and you needed to do this for a grade or to complete a program. But in a way, it's sort of recommitting to that or re-examining it and saying, like, what is my philosophy of education now? And I actually dusted mine out because it's in a 3-ring binder that was done on a word processor, to date myself a little bit. And I reread it and I recognized that almost all of what I wrote many decades ago is still true for me. And I think that was really important, to think that my why doesn't always change, but I actually have a lot more questions and answers for how to actually live that every day. So first and foremost, we want to start with our why and get really clear on our core beliefs. And one way is to keep this question journal. And let's sort of think about what we can do once we feel like we are really clear, like, I know what I believe, but the issue maybe isn't the belief that we're struggling with, but the how do I live that every day in my classroom? That brings us to another way we can teach like ourselves, which is to view our teaching as a practice. And this is a picture of me actually quite a long time ago now, being assisted in a yoga pose by a yoga teacher. And the reason I show this is that in yoga, we don't actually say, I do yoga. We say, I practice yoga. And there's something about that at first always sounded like totally hokey to me, to be honest, like, I practice yoga. Until one day I was in a yoga class and my teacher said to me, Gravity, don't arrive in the pose. You never want to arrive in the pose. And I smiled and I nodded, and then I kept thinking the whole rest of the class, I have no idea what she's talking about. What does she mean, don't arrive in the pose? And then after class, it was bothering me so much, I went up to her and I said, well, what did you mean by that? And she said, well, when you arrive in the pose, you think you've mastered it already. When you were in that warrior pose, were you aware of what was going on with the back toe and your back leg? And were you breathing into all the ribs, front and back in your body? And what was going on in your jaw at the time? Was it relaxed or was it tense? And she asked me a series of questions, and I realized, like, I had no idea what the answers were. And she says, when you arrive in the pose, you stop being curious about your practice, and you're missing all those opportunities to get to know yourself better and to refine the kind of yoga practice you want to have. And so I remind myself of that all the time as a teacher. How do I become the kind of teacher who never arrives in my teaching practice, but continually recognizes there are things that I might be missing, I know I'm missing, and there are places that are unexamined, and those are exciting to me, that can help me look forward to each day as an opportunity to be a better teacher than I was the day before. And this led me to really researching practice even more. And through looking at this idea of practice through different disciplines and from different researchers, I recognize that there are, for the sake of today, I'll say 4 main types of practice that we can think about. And as I'm naming each of these and briefly describing them, I'm going to invite you to reflect a little bit on which of these types of practices do you feel like you do on a regular basis, and which of these do you maybe want to try out a little bit more or be a little bit more intentional around. So one type of practice we do is we create routines through repetitive practice. As a novice teacher, this is where I put all my attention, and that was totally normal and fine. I wanted to make sure I could take attendance, and I needed to have a routine that went the same every day. I don't want to have to be creative each day about how to take attendance. It's a clear routine that I'm just going to do in a rote kind of way to get the job done. Another kind of repetitive practice might be ones I teach my students for how do they gather in the beginning of a class, or how we end a class, or how they keep track of the books that they've read. So routines are really important for things that go the same every day, but not for things that really require any level of cognition, which is also a lot of what happens in class. So another type of practice is original practice, which is all about creating solutions. And I didn't realize as an early novice teacher how much of my job was going to be becoming a solution finder. And so the work of original practice is seeing my role as every day having an opportunity to create something that never existed before. And the reason for that is I've never been teaching this day with this particular student. I've taught students before, and I've taught this content before maybe, but never in this exact way. And every student I've ever met poses some beautifully unique challenge that, I get to create for. So the work of original practice is being open to the fact that it's my job, of course, with the support of others and colleagues, but to find solutions every day. And you might find yourself doing a lot of that, especially in certain times of the year with certain classes or certain areas of your curriculum. A third type of practice is what I'm calling mindful practice, which is all about creating awareness. And what I mean by mindfulness is not necessarily what I learned as a yogi. It could be if that's where your background is. But somebody like Ellen Langer, who is not a yogi by any means, or not even necessarily known in any way for any sort of spiritual practice, she's a researcher out of Harvard who comes at this from a very logical perspective and is sort of one of the grandmothers of mindfulness. She simply describes mindful practice as the things that you do that you're paying attention to and not going by habit. And I'm not really explaining that clearly. Let me rephrase that a little bit. I'm saying this without my notes. Let me do it a little more mindfully. It's what we pay attention to on purpose is a lot of what our mindful practice is. So if I purposely say I'm going to pay attention to the language I use when I give my students feedback, it becomes a mindful practice, as opposed to just giving feedback without paying attention to the language I'm using. So every time we say, I'm going to pay attention on purpose to this, whatever this might be, we're creating an awareness in ourselves. And of course, we could be offering the same to our students. A lot of teaching can sometimes be mindless as opposed to mindful because we're so overwhelmed. So for me, I have to really be intentional about choosing mindful practice every day. And the last type of practice I'm calling playful practice, which is all about creating our instincts as teachers. And the way I'm defining play here is not necessarily taking out Legos or finger paints or, the things that I'm doing on a daily basis with my little baby. What I just mean by play is how the researchers define it as play is anything you do because it brings innate joy to you by doing it in and of itself, not because of a reward or punishment. It's sort of a playful attitude where I want to do this because there's something intrinsically valuable to trying this out. And so to me, it's more of a mind frame of when I bring this sort of playful mind frame into my teaching, not because I have to, or because someone is making me do something, but because I'm curious about what's going to happen. It helps me hone my instincts. And we know from the research on play that that's how we've evolved as a species, is that play has taught us more than lots of other types of practices. So as I described each of these, I'm hoping there's a couple of those that you're like, I've got that is in my wheelhouse. That's the type of practice I do daily. But there might also be some of these types of practice that are less natural to you, or that you spend less time intentionally choosing. And it's an invitation for you to get curious about it, just like my yoga teacher asked me to get curious about parts of my yoga practice that I wasn't prior to this. Let's think about how do we get the courage to do that. So one of the things that struck me most was how when we're feeling powerless, it's almost impossible to be intentional in our practice. We can't teach like ourselves from a place of powerlessness. So we can't really achieve anything unless we feel powerful. Yet traditional notions of power often don't work in school because we don't have power over a lot of things. We don't get to choose who our students are most of the time. We don't choose who their parents are. In many cases, we don't choose the resources we have. We don't choose our colleagues. We don't choose our curriculum. We don't always even choose the lessons and the order that we have to teach them. If I could go on, and we don't choose the hours we work. We don't even choose when we get to go to the bathroom. It's like, I could go on and on and on. And what that could really do is make us feel totally defeated. But this really brought me to Amy Cuddy's research. And what she found is there's two types of power. There's power over others, and then there's personal power, which is the kind of power that nobody has to grant us, that doesn't require us to be able to make the choices I just described. So personal power, I'm actually going to go back for a second. Personal power is free. You don't need permission from an administrator or a colleague. Really what it is, it's your ability to recognize that while you don't have control over anybody else, you do have control over yourself. And when you recognize that, it can actually be, at least in my experience, one of the most freeing aspects of my life, especially as a teacher. Because when I get so caught up in all the things that are external to me that I have no control over, it brings me right back into fear and right back into that paralysis. So what Amy Cuddy found was that personal power allows us to do the things that can feel scary. It allows us to make choices from a place that's really intentional, and allows us to practice all 4 of those types of practices I mentioned on the slide before. And here it is. It is so simple, it almost, feels like it wouldn't be true. In order to feel personally powerful, all you really need to do is do what she calls flip a switch. It's flipping a switch in our brain from feeling powerless to powerful. And when we feel powerful, her research has found we are less self-focused and less anxious. And that anxiety creates a sense of feeling powerless, but being powerless creates a sense of anxiety. It's this cycle that a lot of us, and if you could see me, I'm like, shaking my head as I'm drinking my tea here, explaining this to you, but almost every teacher I've ever met has experienced. And in fact, I read recently in the Teacher Federation Journal that they surveyed teachers, and 93% of thousands of elementary teachers who were surveyed self-reported the highest levels of anxiety on the anxiety scales, the highest level, 93%. So if you're wondering what you can do, here are 2 concrete things you can try out. So you want to prime your brain for feeling personally powerful by flipping that switch at the start of each day, certainly at the start of your teaching day. One way you can do that is to think of a previously powerful moment that you've had in your life. It doesn't have to be a teaching moment, that doesn't matter, but to just close your eyes for 30 seconds, doesn't even always take that long, and actually visualize or go back into your memory to a time in your life when you felt powerful. You don't need to justify it or explain it. Somebody recently, when I did this, said to me, I couldn't think of one, and then I remembered the moment I delivered my baby. Boy, did I feel powerful, right? It doesn't, for me, it could be that moment of jumping off the trapeze, but a time when you felt like, I've got this. And when you do that, it actually lowers your anxiety, prevents your nervous system from going into fight or flight, and allows you to start your day from a place where you recognize you have more control over yourself than you would think. Now, what's great about this is it can become a practice that you teach your students also. So you could even start every period or every day taking 30 seconds to prime your brain in this way by remembering a previously powerful moment. Another practice, you could do these in tandem or you could do this instead of the one I just mentioned, is to create a mantra for yourself that makes you feel powerful. So if you've ever been an athlete or an athlete, they all have some sort of mantra they say to themselves. And not too recently, because I was pregnant and then had a baby, but prior to that, my best friend, Renee, and I were involved in running many marathons and triathlons and Ironman. We were crazy people who would, do 12 and 13-hour races. And people would often say to me, like, why? Which that's a whole other conversation. But then they would say, how did you get through it? And one of the things that really helped us is we had mantras that we would say to ourselves and to each other. And one of them I'll never forget is whenever we were going up a hill, whether that was running up a hill or biking up a hill, now there was no swimming up a hill, but it felt like it sometimes, we would say out loud or to ourselves, I would say this, it's so cheesy to admit it, I'm glad you can't see me blush, but I would say, my body is a machine. My body is a machine. And as hokey as that sounded, it helped me get through this because the pain was very real, but believing my body was a machine helped me get through it. And I have a friend who is a performance psychologist, and she's worked with Marines. She's worked with lots of military folks. She's worked with professional and college athletes. And she said she taught every one of them to come up with some sort of powerful mantra statement that they would say to themselves, not just when things got hard and painful, but also when things were going well, and that it really scientifically works. So for any of you who are tuning in right now, who know your core beliefs or are reconnecting with them, but often feel like you don't have the power to live them, here are 2 things you do have the power to do. And my suggestion is you have to do them daily. If you do it once in a while when you're having a rough day, it won't have the same impact. But watch and see how it changes every day with your students, and feel free to have them join you as you practice them. So far I've talked about really getting in touch with your core beliefs and then viewing your teaching as a practice. So a third way we can teach like ourselves is to build balanced relationships. And the word balance is really key here, because I've never met a teacher, I shouldn't say never, probably somewhere I have, but it's not the norm, that I've met teachers who would say, you know what, I get back just as much as I give. By nature, it seems like every teacher I know is a giver and a nurturer and somebody who loves to help others, which is why we went into this profession, and that's beautiful. Yet at the same time, if we're not in a balanced relationship, and the relationship that we're not getting to be able to receive and nurture ourselves and take care of ourselves, or if we have a relationship that's less than ideal, it does have an impact on our ability to be the best teachers we can be. And so I put this illustration from Arnold Lobel's Frog and Toad, because they're sort of one of my relationship role models. In fact, my husband and I love Frog and Toad so much that they were the readings at our wedding. If you don't know Frog and Toad, run to the bookstore, library, and do some reading. And if you know them, maybe go ahead and read them with that lens of what can you learn about the kind of relationships that you might aspire to have. So what Frog and Toad are great at is helping one another and making sure both people are happy in the relationship. So I decided to look at relationship research and say, how can I steal some of those ideas and bring them into my own teaching and share those with other teachers? Here's something that totally blew my mind. If a friend who lives within a mile of your home becomes happier, it will increase the probability of your own happiness by 25%. I don't totally get why, and I don't know that they've proven that yet. But think about that for a moment. Somebody that you're friends with, just simply by them becoming happier and they live within a mile of you, is going to lead to you likely being happier. So if we translate that to our schools, if a teacher next door to you becomes happier, it's not just going to help them and their students, it's going to help you, because your happiness levels are likely to increase. If the teacher around the corner or on the other side of the building increases their happiness levels, it's likely going to increase your own. So this is, yes, unselfish to want our colleagues and the people in our lives to be happy just for them to be happy, but also selfishly, it's going to increase our own happiness levels. And one thing that is super clear in the research on happiness, and it doesn't take a doctorate to know this, even though folks with lots of degrees have proven this, is that we know now from people like Sean Acker's research that the happier you are, the more successful you are at your job. So let's look at, some of the ways that we can actually live this. So Amy Cuddy's research looked at relationships to say that basically, what makes some relationships work a whole lot better than others. And what she found was that there's 2 qualities. Oh my goodness. Sorry about that, everybody. I guess just now, Adobe wanted to ask for a reminder. Okay, sorry, we're back into that. So what Amy Cuddy's research found was that there's 2 really essential ingredients in relationships that are working. That people need to be competent and be viewed as competent, and there also needs to be trust. But what was interesting in the research is they found when the 2 were sort of head to head, trustworthiness is always way more important than competence. Because competence without trustworthiness or without being trusted is actually rather dangerous. Because if somebody is very good at what they do, but you don't trust them, the relationship is never going to succeed or work. On the other hand, if you trust somebody, but they're not yet that competent at their job, for example, maybe a novice teacher or somebody who's newer to a grade level or a curriculum or a subject area, you can always learn to be more competent as a teacher, but the trust is almost impossible to repair or will take a really long time. So I just love these 2 images I found to show the difference between what competence and trustworthiness looks like, and to recognize that trust is actually the most important thing and most primary in all the relationships we have as teachers, with our students, with parents, with colleagues, with the leaders in our building, and also with ourselves. So here's something that surprised me. The relationship research was full of surprises for me, for sure, is that one of the main ways to build trust in a relationship is not just how we respond and support one another when bad things happen, but it actually, a key way to build trust is to think about how you respond when somebody shares good news with you. And they found in their research there were 4 main styles of how people responded to each other's good news. So I'm going to give an example as I go through this. So one type is what they call passive constructive responses. So this is when you respond in an unenthusiastic way. So let's imagine a scenario where maybe the good news is you applied for a grant for some books to put in your classroom that your students could be reading. And when you share this good news with a colleague, a passive constructive response would just be, oh, you got the grant, okay. Kind of unenthusiastic and neutral. Another style of response is what they call passive destructive responses. And this is when you respond by turning the conversation back to yourself. So again, you say, oh my gosh, I got that grant for books for my classroom. And somebody would say, oh, you know what? I have so many books in my classroom, I don't even know what to do with them. So you see, turning it back to themselves. Active destructive responses are when you actually have a negative response and you actively squelch the person's good news. That response would sound like this. Oh, you got the grant? Well, let's see if they ever even give you those books. And if you send those books home, the students are going to lose them anyway, so I don't even know why you bother. The only kind of response you want to have is the one I put in box in blue. It's an active constructive response. This is when you offer enthusiastic, unbridled support. It would sound something like this. Oh my gosh, that is amazing. I'm so excited for you and your students. Those books are going to be devoured by them, and it's going to be so amazing. Want me to come help you to organize them so you can get them in your students' hands as soon as possible? I'd love to help. Okay. It might seem obvious, but each of those examples I gave are based on true life experiences that I've had as a teacher. And I'm also going to be honest that on my worst days, I'm not always the best at that active constructive response. I'd like to think I'm not ever doing that active destructive responding, but I know there's probably been times where I've done the other two. And so if you're somebody who feels like there's at least one relationship, whether it's with a student or a colleague or a parent or an administrator that is less than ideal, one of the best things you can do to rebuild that relationship or to strengthen one is to go out of your way to have that active constructive response when it comes to good news that they're sharing. And again, this is something totally free and you don't need permission to do it. So the last practice I want to offer about relationships has to do with actually the research on divorce rates. And I know we are not literally married to our jobs, although it might feel like that sometimes. But what they found is that people who stay married, and particularly stay happily married, have what they call a 5-to-1 ratio. That for every one negative interaction, they have 5 positive interactions. So it's not that there's never disagreement or never arguing or fighting, that there are. I mean, that's inevitable if you're going to have an authentic relationship. But you want to balance that out with 5 positive ones. So I'm not going to read this list to you because I think a lot of these positive interactions I have listed here are super obvious. It's just something to think about that for me, again, this gives me a little bit of that extra courage to speak up when I think this might actually cause a little disconnect or even a little bit of an argument or disagreement in a relationship, is to say there are times when I need to be brave and speak up for what I believe in. And it's totally okay to do that if I can keep in mind that 5-to-1 ratio. Or if you had a negative interaction with a colleague or a parent or a student, to just go out of your way to try some of these others to counteract and remain in a trusting relationship and knowing it's not the end of the world, but maybe do a little bit more. And I'll just say that the one on this list that I think is really important is that making jokes part. It's really important to be able to laugh. You know, I find that when people laugh together, not at each other, but together with one another, those are usually the relationships that are the most authentic. And that's actually going to lead to a tip I have coming up in a little bit. So a fourth way we can teach like ourselves is to drive our own professional growth. And this a little bit ties into what I said earlier about in yoga, how we never want to arrive in the pose, that we never want to arrive as teachers who feel like we have nothing left to learn. And so if you look here at this photograph, this is my own writing notebook. I've been a teacher of writing since I can remember, even actually before I became an official teacher. And I am constantly writing myself because I can't teach something that I'm not practicing on a regular basis. And I think that, you know, you're the kind of person who already gets this because you're on this webinar, right? And so part of it, what I want to talk about today is just simply thinking about how do we not just grow on our own, but how do we enlist the support of a learning partner or a coach and leverage our colleagues as also people who can really help us to grow, because I know that I would never be the teacher I am if it wasn't for the people in my life who've been either official coaches or unofficial, you know, learning partners who helped me on my journey. One of my favorite books about coaching is a book called The Coaching Habit by the author whose name is on here, Michael Bungay-Stanier, or Stan, I don't know how you pronounce his last name. That's why I have it here. But this is what he says. Coaching can fuel the courage to step out beyond the comfortable and familiar, can help people learn from their experiences, and can literally and metaphorically increase and help fulfill a person's potential. So to me, even if I felt like I've got this, like if there was a time in my career where things were going well, there's always something else that I can be doing, because potential is something that's like never arrived at, right? And so one of the things that I suggest every teacher, veteran and newbie and anyone in between, do is seek out someone to help coach them. If you are a coach, kudos to you, and I'm sure you're already doing this, but even coaches need coaching. If you're a teacher or if you're an administrator, how are you going to seek somebody who can coach you? And it might be that you're not in a district that has somebody with that official title of coach or that official title of mentor, but that doesn't mean that you can't benefit from that. When I started teaching third grade, I'll never forget that I was teaching with a woman named Malini, who was down the hall from me, and I admired her greatly. But we both started, even though she had been teaching longer, we both entered third grade as newbie third grade teachers the same year. And I remember going in almost every day at the end of the day to talk to her about her struggles and what was working for her and asking questions. And then at lunch, she would often come into my room. And I remember one day I just said to her, can I just please come in and see how you start your day? I feel like I'm wasting so much time in the beginning of my day. And if there's ever going to be a meltdown, it happens at the beginning of the day. And she said, sure, if I can come in and watch you teach guided reading. And what we started to do without needing, permission from anyone really, was bring our kids into each other's classroom if we couldn't get coverage. So I literally would bring my 27 kids down the hall into Malini's classroom, and she would teach all 50-something kids in the morning so I could see. And she would, on her prep, come in, and I would just teach guided reading on her prep, and she'd sometimes come into my room, and she'd watch guided reading. And it got to the point that we were coaching one another, even as newbies. And I tell you that because I think for some of us, we're sort of alone in our room, like dying for coaching, and it's not being offered to us. And that doesn't mean it can't happen. There's so many ways to be creative. And I think the first thing is to just find a learning partner that you have that trusting relationship with, that you can do that. So this is me with my learning partner that I've had for many years, Renee. And we're doing something silly, who knows what, there together, probably laughing and co-teaching something together. But one of the things that I'll encourage you to do is consider the qualities you want in a learning partner. And if you're lucky enough to already have that learning partner, to maybe take some time to list those qualities so you can name them for yourself and for that person. It's so essential to do this that I have personally, taken it my mission to be a matchmaker to folks who can't find that. The great news is if you're in a building where you feel like I just am not finding that person, you can now reach out globally, whether that's on Twitter or Facebook, I know some folks have connected on the Teach Like Yourself Facebook group that I have that I'll mention at the end. It doesn't have to be somebody who's literally in your building, but nobody can get through this work and reach that potential of who you could be as a teacher if you don't have a coach, mentor, or learning partner. So again, I'll encourage you to sort of list those qualities and ask someone to help you find them. Honestly, I will help you. If you can't find them yourself, then you'll get my information at the end of this session, and I'll help be that matchmaker for you because I think it's that essential. So the last element of teaching like yourself is certainly not least important. It's taking care of yourself. And in some ways, this is foundational and paramount because you can't do the other things I've talked about if you yourself are not well. So you can't reconnect and really name and know your core beliefs and put them into practice and build balanced relationships and drive your own professional growth if you are not well. And as I'm looking at this image, this is mostly to inspire me and to remind myself that this was the hardest chapter for me to write because I'm not the best at putting this into practice every day. Yet, I can read this chapter and coach myself. So one way we can take care of ourselves is to make sure we have some boundaries. Boundaries are super important. And at least for me, it seems like each year as we create more and more technology that connects us, there are benefits, but also drawbacks. So I'm going to share a couple of ideas for how I or teachers I know have started to create some boundaries to create some time for themselves. So one of those is a physical boundary. And what I mean by a physical boundary is, for example, one of my friends and colleagues, Karen, recognized she was literally not getting fresh air like all day, every day, because she was in a classroom that didn't have a lot of windows and also had a lot of fluorescent, terrible light. So she started to, on cool weather days, leave her lunch in the car, and on warm weather days, bring a cooler and leave her lunch in the cooler. And every day at lunch, she would walk out to her car to ensure she got some fresh air and sunlight. That might seem like a little thing, but that can have a huge impact on how you physically feel for the rest of the day. Some teachers go for walks, whatever that might be. Is there a place you might think about a physical boundary in your teaching life? Another is a communication boundary. Here's one that I personally have set and have to recommit to often, and that is to have some time where I'm not going to check email or respond to texts or voicemails. So whether that is on the weekend or after a certain time at night, and it changes for me depending on who and what I'm teaching, but there has to be some time to unplug. And other folks have written a lot about this, and you might need your learning partner to help you stay accountable to that. A third kind of boundary might not even be just related to teaching, but we have lives that are outside of teaching too, which are activity boundaries. And what I mean by that is to recognize how many activities outside of your family and school obligations can you realistically do per week, set that number, and then say no to everything that goes above that number. I heard Oprah in an interview talk about this as honest yeses and honest nos. And the idea, I think she was talking to Byron Katie in this interview, saying that when we say yes to something we don't actually want to do, it's a dishonest yes. And it's not fair to us, and it's not fair to the other people. So these days, as a new mom and as a writer and someone who's back at work, I've committed to only one activity I can handle a week outside of all my other obligations. And so I really think each week about what that one is going to be. And then I let myself have an honest no to the others. And while I'm not always perfect just sticking to it, I find that I actually am a much more balanced person. And even though I have FOMO around certain things, in the long run, I know it's what's right for me and my family. So here's maybe the most important Teach Like Yourself practice, certainly when it comes to self-care, that I want to start to end with. So one of my favorite books ever is called The Art of Possibility. And in that book, they tell a story that actually I've since researched, and actually several people take credit for the story. So to be honest, I'm not even sure who to credit anymore. I'm just going to say that's where I first read it. And it goes like this. There were two prime ministers who were in a somewhat heated discussion. And the hosting prime minister was speaking when all of a sudden in walked one of the people he worked with, barged in, had an urgent issue that needed to be dealt with, was gesticulating with their hands, pounding their fists on the table. And finally, the hosting prime minister said, "Excuse me, I want to remind you of rule number 6. The man who had barged in said, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, you're right," laughed and left the room. A few minutes later, a woman again comes into the meeting, has an urgent issue, is going on and on about it. Again, the hosting prime minister said, "Remember rule number 6. Again, she apologizes, smiles, and leaves the room. When this happens a third time, the visiting prime minister says, "This might not be any of my business, but I've got to know, what the heck is rule number 6? And he said, "Oh, I don't mind sharing. Rule number 6 is very simple. Rule number 6 is this: don't take yourself so damn seriously." And the visiting prime minister started to laugh and said, "Oh, well, what are your other rules?" And the hosting prime minister says, "We don't have any other rules. We don't need any others." And the reason that I just love that story is we have a huge responsibility as teachers. And yes, our work is super serious, yet we don't need to add to our levels of stress and anxiety by making it more serious and taking ourselves so seriously that it just makes it worse. The other thing I just love about this is I know if anybody in my life said to me, "Chill out, Gravity," or "Don't take yourself so seriously," I'd probably have some harsh words back because that feels like a personal attack. But when the people in my life say to me, "Remember rule number 6, I can laugh at myself. I can take that feedback as a reminder, and I can say it even to myself. And then I can, move on without being so darn serious." So you might want to co-opt rule number 6 and use it in your teaching life and your personal life yourself, or maybe you'll have your own sort of code phrase for what that means. But I think it's really important that we remember that just because we're doing serious work doesn't mean we need to take ourselves so darn seriously. So what do we lose if we don't teach like ourselves? If we don't take some of these tips and practices and hold them, true to ourselves? We feel like imposters. Our students get it. They totally know when we're being inauthentic and teaching somebody else's lesson. Our instructional decisions don't really match our students and don't usually work. And we burn out and we lose our passion and energy for the very career that we were so excited to start. None of those are what I want for any teacher, and certainly for any students of those teachers. So to start to wrap up our time together before I take a couple of questions, this is what we talked about today, and there's a chapter dedicated to each of these in the book. When we teach like ourselves, we can name our core beliefs so we're so clear on them and we know our why. We can view our teaching as a practice. We can build balanced relationships. We drive our professional growth so we never feel like we've arrived and learned it all. And we take care of ourselves so that we're well enough to do all of those other things. My last slide is probably the most important to remember, that being your true self as a teacher is exactly what your students need. And I wholeheartedly believe that. When you are you, everything else will work. So if this is something that resonated with you, if you're reading the book, amazing. If not, maybe you'll pick it up. But here are some ways that you can stay connected to this, because this to me is more than a book. It's really a movement I'm starting to create, because I really want every single teacher to step into their classroom as themselves. Every student deserves that. So here's my Twitter handle, and please use the hashtag #TeachLikeYourself. And we also have a Facebook group with about 1,500 teachers, and it's growing every day. I'd love for you to join the Teach Like Yourself Facebook group and connect with like-minded folks. And we'll even be doing a book study in January if you want to participate in that. And here's my personal email address if you'd like to email me with some follow-up questions, ideas, or thoughts. I'll take the last couple of minutes here for a few really short questions. And if there are any questions that were asked that I don't have time to answer on the webinar, I'll personally respond to them here and on the Facebook group. Thank you, everybody.
Hi, I have a question.
Great.
How has Brené Brown's work influenced your work?
Great question. So I've read all of Brené Brown's books. I've read some of her articles. I've watched her webinars. So certainly she's been an inspiration to me. That doesn't mean I agree with 100% of, every single thing she's saying, but I think the biggest part is that her work on being yourself and braving the wilderness, and how to like reconnect with who you are and recognize that that's the courage that you need. It was really huge for me while I was writing this book. And then also her ideas in Daring Greatly have been really, really impactful in terms of, this idea of how do we have courageous conversations? How do we, the honest yeses and honest nos connects a lot to Brene Brown's work. So my short to medium answer is really impactful. If you don't know her work, I would highly recommend it. I'm right now reading her newest book on daring leadership. I really respect a lot of her message, and the fact that it's grounded in her own stories. And that gave me the courage to weave in some of my less than ideal stories that I learned from as a teacher into my own book.
Terrific. I have one last question. When you practice active constructive responses, do colleagues sometimes feel like you're being overly positive or overly polite? Can you be too positive? Is it off-putting in any way?
I really appreciate whoever asked that question. So yes, here's the funny thing about it. Kids are our best models, right? Like the younger the kid, the better they are at enthusiastic, unbridled excitement for other people, right? Like I'll never forget, just one quick story about this is the first time I ran the New York City Marathon. I went back to my students 2 days later. I took a day off to recuperate and I went back. And I remember my students, and I was teaching third grade special education at the time. They came in, did you win? Did you win the marathon? Right? How cute and naive of them. And I said, no, I did not win the New York City Marathon. There were like 40,000 people who ran it. And I came back from lunch that day and they had made banners and signs for me that said, even though you didn't win, you're still a winner to us. And they cheered for me, right? There's this like lesson there of how excited kids can be for adults and for one another. And I feel like the older we get, we lose that. And yes, it can be super off-putting for people because it's not necessarily the way we normally respond in our lives to be genuinely excited in that enthusiastic way. So my recommendation would be, one, to sometimes say like, in a way, like, who cares? If you're the positive person, I'd rather be labeled for that. But also maybe to find your way to do it. Like the way I modeled might not be your way. It could be way more subtle. It could be an email that said, hey, congrats on that. Do you need some help with the books? I'm excited for you. Like, I think we each have to find the way that's, again, authentic to us. And I think in some ways, the other thing is to share this research. I've shared it at professional learning communities and professional development sessions and said, hey, look at this research. I know I have some work to do here. What do you guys think about that? So, when in doubt, I think why not err on the side of positivity? And if it feels totally awkward, maybe share the research and give yourself permission to say to your colleagues, I know this is a little awkward, but let's try it out together.
Thank you, Dr. Goldberg. I'm going to turn it over to Ariel Curry again and let her finish up the meeting. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. So thank you so much, Gravity. I know your book has really inspired me. Even though I'm not in a classroom every day, it still has inspired me to know my purpose and my core beliefs and to just help me show up authentically. And so I really hope that everyone here on this webinar and reading the book gets the same message and leaves equally inspired. So for those listening, like Gravity said, please do join the Facebook group. It's a really great community and some awesome conversations are happening there. And you can join on Twitter with the hashtag #TeachLikeYourself. This Thursday, Gravity is going to be leading a Twitter chat that's hashtag G2Great around the book as well. So you can join that. And then finally, if you don't have the book but are interested in reading it, it's available at Corwin.com and Amazon and pretty much anywhere where you buy books. So that's all. And again, thank you so much, Gravity, and hope everyone has a wonderful night.